those of you who are not Floridians, and I can see a few of you who are not Floridians, welcome to the South. I'm going to talk about, try to tie up something. Every longleaf pine talk will have something about fire in it. If you hadn't flown in yesterday on a really soggy day, you would have seen probably lots of smoke in the landscape. So I want to talk about prescribed fire in southeastern pinelands, which is what I'll call them, not forests or woodlands or anything else, and talk about some of the challenges and the opportunities, and what, at least from my perspective. And I would like to provide some, a welcome to the local area. You obviously know that you're sitting here in North Florida. This is the lightning capital either of the United States, the Western Hemisphere, or of the planet, depending on which data you believe. There are a lot of lightning strikes. Orlando is the epicenter of lightning strikes in North America. This map here depicts that pretty well. The whole peninsula of Florida gets lots of lightning. Lightning here often co-occurs with precipitation, but still lots of lightning and lots of opportunities for ignitions. Also, this area, if you were to map human settlement in 1400, Florida would be a very high density population, much as it is today. Lots of tribes in Florida, very active in burning, and that translated or carried over into European and African settlers in the region, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s. Maybe what you don't know about Florida, a range meeting in Florida makes a lot of sense because this historically was a major range state, a very rural state prior to 1945. Once we started to refrigerate and air condition this place and drain wetlands, this area became much more populated. So lots of cattle were running over Florida, and lots of turpentining operations. The naval storage industry was very strong here. And what all of these industries and the settlers and the tribes and lightning had in common was making lots of fire on the landscape. So this area, all of these talks naturally will revolve around fire because fire was so dominant here. And that carried over. The culture here is also a pretty rebellious culture. Historically, they've been clearly rebellious, and they pushed back on lots of efforts to stamp out the use of burning on the landscape. Lots of heroes of resistance here. So if there was lots of fire, it should not be surprising that a lot of the species that are here reflect their smoky or fiery past. We just had ad nauseum here on wiregrass, Arista stricta, arguably Stricta berrichiana or Stricta alone. It's a species that has marked increases in flowering following growing season fires. Almost no flowering in fires that occur in other times of the year. Almost no flowering when no fires occur, but when fires occur during a relatively narrow period, a real strong peak in its flowering response. So clear adaptation to large-scale fires. This thing here, the gopher tortoise, a land turtle in the southeast, endangered and state threatened in large parts of its range, not here, once very common across these sandy xeric landscapes, also clearly responded to the openings that fire created and the stature of plants that came back. If you're a small tortoise, it's very difficult to eat tall things. And so they like the low-growing plants, particularly those that have high nutrient quality that's generated in burning. Anyway, this big clump of species here, some that like longleaf pine, hasn't been pointed out, but a weird characteristic of longleaf pine, this landscape dominant, it has an awkward juvenile stage. It germinates, and then rather than having height growth, it focuses its growth on below ground growth. And so we call this stage the grass stage. So you see this little thing here, and I'll show you a couple more in a minute in the landscape. This is a tiny little longleaf pine seedling, unbranched, a very awkward juvenile growth. Stays at this very low stage waiting for a larger accumulation of either below ground carbohydrates or some sort of size or below ground storage. Lots of carnivorous plants. I could go on for days. A clear adaptation to this landscape of fire. Prairies have made it to stamps, and in the places that you work, that's always a bad sign when you make it into a stamp. You either have already died or you're on your way out. Redwood forest, tallgrass prairie, and also what people have called longleaf pine forests have made it on the large stamp series. So, troubling. This is kind of a classic photo. You've seen a few of these already. You saw nice pictures of Ocala, Apalachicola Bluffs. This is Eglin Air Force Base, and military installations in the southeast are areas where lots of longleaf ecosystems were maintained because they like to set things on fire. And this is one of the largest reserves of longleaf pine in existence. And here you can see both these really towering, almost like it's a woodland to a savanna, arguably, towering trees that don't get very tall. And then this is a juvenile that's moving from this sort of very small grass stage as it bolts up, presumably to escape flaming, moving up really rapidly to escape the injuries caused by fire. And then here are the oaks that we just talked about, lots of sprouting oaks, and you'll see scattered oaks in these systems. The pine oak, aristida over large portions of its range, and then a high variety of the blue stems once you move a little farther west. It was mentioned earlier, so it's part of this history, and all these feed into the challenges for fire in this region. There was the Southern Forestry Education Project, which entailed people, you can go back through history, people from the north coming to the south to tell them what they were doing was wrong. It didn't go over very well. My grandmother, a North Florida resident, in church, hearing about the evils of these people that set the woods on fire, who happened to be her father. Very upsetting, very terrible time in our period. We also were subject to a lot of fire suppression and that you all know about, but it's affected the landscapes throughout North America. Fire suppression has a clear negative impact on many landscapes. I don't have to tell you that story. Along these challenges, some of the consequences. I mentioned in that picture there that you saw those individual species. Those didn't look like the common species that you would see walking around outside the building here. There are quite a few large-scale biodiversity losses with many animals, many plants. The numbers that co-occur in southeastern pinelands are, people say 20 federally listed or as endangered, another 80 as threatened. Those numbers could be an order of magnitude low. Many endangered and threatened plants and animals. And here I'm using the word forest for a reason. These savannas and woodlands changed, and they changed into very high density landscapes that lots of understory plants have a serious time dealing with. Much more dense, much more shade, and in these systems that many people, you may be upset by this, but if you're in the southeast, lots of folks will call these longleaf pine grasslands, which is upsetting probably to range managers, but they call them grasslands because the forest floor looks much like, or the herbaceous cover looks much like a grassland. They don't accumulate litter unless it's grasses or forbs. And in systems where you allow fire to be suppressed, they develop forest floor. And it's a really dramatic, as you know from other stories of encroachment, a dramatic change in the understory environment. And the fires that occurred in these systems clearly changed, and I'll talk about this in a little bit. Many of you are associated with land management. I don't have to tell you this, fire is pretty cheap. It's really cheap in the southeast. The numbers will just make you sad. Clearly you can treat large areas, in stark contrast to a lot of other land management tools where you talk about prices per acre that preclude large-scale landscape treatments. Fire can be used on tremendous landscapes without much of a hiccup. You can also manage the intensity and the effects. If we're trying to mimic or emulate fire as it was on some landscape, clearly using fire is makes a pretty good surrogate, or at least a copy of this. And this all fits into this general idea of what prescribed fire is. The objectives in the southeast are much as they are in your own locations. Let's go through this. I'll do it quickly. Reduce hazardous fuels, a long time line item on burning in the southeast. Reducing fuels makes a lot of sense, makes people very happy, and in several of the longleaf pine ecosystems, there was a dichotomy mentioned just before between what we call sandhills, these xeric uplands, and flatwoods, which are more mesic, sometimes almost dihydric systems. In those systems, we were given our own fuel model a long time ago. This is a fuel model 7 or Southern Rough that you may have heard about. It's a famous fuel model, very intense flame lengths. It burns as a shrub model, very similar to a lot of other rangeland systems. And so using fire to reduce these fuels has always made a lot of sense. Improving habitat, site preparation. If on your flight, if you weren't flying in yesterday and you could see the landscape, this is an intensively managed landscape, lots of pine production, and site preparation. Burning is still a major land use. It's diminishing in some ways, but still is a major land treatment. It's great for managing tree competition. This is not surprising. Controlling insects and diseases. There's the forage word. They look nice. From a timber management standpoint, we have measured the willingness to pay or actual real offers for timber volumes based on the access provided to cruising. So people that have burned their timber, identical volumes, 2 stands, one is easier to move around in, the bid is higher on the one that's easy to move around in. It's easier to operate, and it's also easier to estimate the volume. So it's win-win-win-win-win. It clearly perpetuates fire-dependent species, and we could go on this for days again too. But what you want to see were the challenges. It's nice to have that thing in the picture already. Clearly the challenge, and the part that you noticed whether or not it was foggy when you came in or rainy when you came in, there are a lot of people in Florida. Zach, what's the daily rate now?
19 million and counting.
19 million and counting. How many people come to Florida each day? Or how many people, what's the net every day?
I think it's thousands.
Yes, it baffles the mind. It's Montana moving to Florida, or Wyoming moving to Florida every day. Tremendous influx of people every day.
But a lot die. That's the thing.
That's
people come here. People come here to die.
They've taken up most of their life expectancy already.
It's true.
But a lot of people are here.
Delta's the biggest exporter.
Yeah.
And for those of us who live in other areas of the South, just as California drives a lot of national policy, something happens in California, it's bound to happen in Oregon, Washington, etc. very quickly. Florida is the same harbinger for the Southeast. Mississippi, a very rural state, has tremendous growth in the coastal areas, tremendous human growth. And so these same sorts of things we might think of as isolated in that poor state of Florida, but they're happening everywhere, and that really challenges the future. Smoke is an ever-present issue. Historically, for fire management in the Southeast, it's been related to visibility. Lots of traffic fatalities caused by smoke on highways. Smoke tends to creep to low positions, and in this region, low positions are where roads are. And so it's been a persistent, very upsetting issue in fire management, as you might imagine. The future, though, is that fire managers are being looked at increasingly from an emissions inventory standpoint. The future is very scary from a lot of prescribed fire management, large-scale landscape prescribed fire management. The EPA and then the state and regional air quality management districts, or whatever that version is, are increasingly looking at prescribed burning as a source of emissions. Fire consumes carbon, but it generates it in somewhere else, right? It's not destroyed, it just moves into carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and this long string of potential carbon compounds. So we're being looked at more and more in the future. Any day we fight off these sorts of threats all the time, and so smoke is a really big issue, not just from the old visibility standpoint, but from this increasing focus on emissions. There are lots of ways to look at this, and people are looking at carbon in all sorts of ways, but our generation of emissions is a big deal. We're also working under novel conditions, and it seems sort of silly to say, but things have changed, and things continue to change. I have these photos here to remind me to say there are a lot of people. People are living in wild areas, or at least formerly burned areas. They're coming every day. This is an Orlando shot, and there are a lot of retirees here. And from a fire management standpoint, it's not just your proximity to people, it is your proximity to people with compromised breathing. Nationally, we think that in wildlands, something like 30% of people have some issue, upper respiratory issue, which is just stunning to think about. In Florida, that number is much higher. And the evacuation of people from their homes because of smoke, if you're a young thrifty college professor, you can that's fine to leave your house. But if you are dependent on oxygen or dependent on some other sorts of care, it's a very big issue. And so Florida, when there are large-scale evacuations, it's a much bigger deal than it is if it's North Mississippi or Northern California. And we also have a challenge of improving prescribed fire. Prescribed fire is not perfect the way it is. I'm an advocate of prescribed fire. I serve on I'm the president or chair of the Coalition of Prescribed Fire Councils nationally. I love prescribed fire, but we know we have problems with it. In this state, if we were to get an argument over drinks before this presentation today, Zach and I started talking about season of burn. He and I got into it pretty heavily. Luckily, no blows came to the face, but it's a very big issue in this region. This map here, you can't really see it, but what you should see is yellow and red. This yellow and red corresponds to the natural fire season and the actual fire season. This is a paper that was last year in Frontiers in Ecology and Environment. In some regions of the country, you find a perfect overlap of the natural fire season and when we burn. In Florida, you see really strong differences. Here's Ocala, Florida. And then if we start talking about what the natural fire season is, again, we can get to another huge fight. Lita will kick me in the knee or something else. So there are huge issues that we have with prescribed fire. We manage the boundaries of prescribed fires in a lot of diverse ways, and that's something that we're focusing on in the future. We've used very heavy-handed approaches with plows, et cetera, that disturb soil, and that was well prior to lots of invasive grasses in this region. Impera, a major invasive grass, Impera cylindrica, that causes lots of problems in many different systems. Lots of non-native herbs, altered community states, something that rangeland community's been thinking about for a long time. And a new discussion or argument about how natural are these fires. Do they approximate either what we call a natural fire or wildfire effects? You can imagine us going down into this hole. So very briefly, what are the opportunities rather than focusing on the challenges? You flew into an area where there's very strong public support for prescribed burning. It defies what you think you see on the DC media or LA media. Very strong regional support for prescribed fire. Because in Florida and throughout the Southeast, but in particular in Florida, it has been linked to biodiversity conservation. And that's a winner every time in all sorts of outreach studies and studies to look at people's willingness to support something about land management. Biodiversity conservation rises to the top. People love gopher tortoises. And talking about hazardous fuel reduction tends to not be as successful. Lots of threatened endangered species here. Fire hazard reduction is also important because if you don't love the fuzzy creatures, you clearly don't want your home to be burned up. And it's pretty cheap. It's widely adaptable, you know that. In Florida, sort of one of the last things I want to say, there have been a series, a national leading, maybe globally leading, prescribed burning laws that are related to these rights to burn. In California, where I lived for 8 years, using the phrase right to burn can get you arrested. But in Florida, it has long been considered a right to burn. And this is the old Florida prescribed burning law, and it has a gross negligence standard. Gross negligence is you were told not to do it and you did it anyway. And you threw away the receipts. So a very wide scale, whether you're Democrat or Republican, lots of support from the State House, etc. Okay. The last thing I think is also a nice way to see this landscape. You also saw a lot of really cool looking retirement homes, etc. This is a spot from west of Gainesville, just up the road on I-75. You can see the juxtaposition of this place. Here's I-75, major north-south corridor. Here's among the largest universities in the country, 50,000 students. There's a large hospital there. And here is a golf course community, a $1.6 million home that occurs next to the 10th hole. If you've played that one, you know it's a killer. And this is an area where there is support for prescribed burning. And I think this is always, it's always nice to look at Florida for great examples to export and take elsewhere. In this area, if you can read into this, it's kind of small for you, but it says, longleaf pine sandhill species with showy flowers were of specific interest because these plants were more likely to attract the attention of residents, these folks, and golfers viewing the burn patches. So they were burning the rough. And that's how widespread the support is in this individual region. Tomorrow at 3:20, I'm going to talk about prescribed fire councils. I don't know where that talk is, but if you have something, if you're open at 3:20 tomorrow, I'll be happy to talk to you about this ad nauseum. And I'll leave you with that.
There'll be time for more questions and discussions, so jot down your questions if we have additional ones. But let's open it up for Dr. Byron for one question.
Yes, sir.
Morgan, is there any way to make a case statement that by enhancing the long lead time that we're sequestering more carbon when we harvest it in the future than we will send out there in smoke?
Yeah, so there's been, I hinted at that a little bit. There's a tremendous amount of work going on with this right now because it's a complex story. You know, the simple story is, you know, the sort of what has been CNN nightly news as a forest, it burns, and what a disaster for carbon is. There's this clear threat of loss. There are people in this room who've done this sort of research for the last 10 years. The story is a little complicated. There's a lot of work looking at this issue. So the carbon story, you want to say something about it, Lee?
It's complicated.
Yeah.
And who's got the better PR?
Yeah, well, they pay more, okay?
Well, some of it's ecosystems too. I mean, now we're getting this weird stuff at the grassy ecosystems. They may be storing more carbon underground than we ever thought. And by routinely burning them, there's more being in the ground than being released. So it's yeah, complex.
So do those rhizomes eat carbon?
They're definitely holding some carbon, and that's a neat thing about these frequently burned systems is there's a lot of stuff happening below ground. You know, I think it's likely very shocking to many of you to see these photos, Zach's photos, with that time span where you go from here it is a month, here it is 4 months. It's a very rapid response to these systems, and so there's clearly a large amount of storage that's taking place, and the persistence of this carbon above ground and below ground is clearly very high when they're maintained with frequent fire. But yeah, that's a challenge of the future, and the way we're managing that nationally is to talk about the persistence of carbon and not this large pulse of carbon, and then playing biodiversity cards, because clearly that's the you know, we don't want to be, we suffered through 20 or 30 years, particularly in the western United States, on this sort of single species management, and what we don't want to do now is go to a single element management. Carbon is important, but so are all these other things, and trying to keep that dialogue where we don't have to say it's 2.3% higher carbon retention than this option, but say, yes, you're also sequestering carbon, but doing all these other great things too.
Great, thank you.